Hi, Stacy OT here. You've got questions, I've got answers. Let's get started. Today's question is about IEPs, or individualized education plans, and what exactly qualifies a student. We're going to focus mainly on the rules and laws in New York State. One, because it's what I'm most familiar with, having worked with my own son and getting him through the school system. And two, because New York and the New England area in general for education tends to be the gold standard in New York State that other states emulate, and it's by far the most complicated. So in New York, there are 13 categories of disability, so to speak, that a child has to fall into to get an IEP. Don't worry, because they cover like every possible disability. In alphabetical order, they are autism, deafness, deaf-blind, an emotional disturbance, so this would be some type of mental illness that keeps them from participating in school fully, hearing impairment, a learning disability, and that's not just, well, my kid's not a great reader. No, it has to be an actual documented learning disability, an intellectual disability, a multiple disabilities, so a little bit of this, a little bit of that, some sort of orthopedic impairment, so if they have a bone disorder that keeps them from being able to navigate the school and thereby they need special accommodations, an IEP is appropriate. Other health impairment. This is typically where children with ADD or ADHD get put into. It's not exactly mental health. It's not one of the other categories, but it definitely impacts their education. So otherwise, health impairment is kind of a catch-all for anything that doesn't fit the other 13. So as I said, almost any disability can get put somewhere. Speech or language impairment. This is really common, especially in the preschool age groups. Traumatic brain injury. That could have been a stroke at birth, all the way up to they were in a car accident which impacted their cognition or brain function in some way. And visual impairment, which includes blindness also. So any sort of visual impairment. Those are the 13 categories. Now, just having a diagnosis alone that fits into a category, say a child has cerebral palsy, but if it doesn't impact them at school, they don't qualify for an IEP, even if they have a disability. So a child might have autism, but they do really well academically and really well socially and really well emotionally, and they don't qualify. So what is the actual nitty-gritty of how the person qualifies? Because just the parents want it and the school says, we don't want to provide it, is kind of a sticky situation. There are actual guidelines, and typically this comes down to the evaluation. They are required to be evaluated every 3 years if they are receiving an IEP to see if they still qualify for it. Parents, you can request that they be evaluated. Make sure you do it in writing. And the school typically has 60 business days to get that evaluation done to see if your child initially qualifies. Make sure that you state in there what is being impacted at school that's causing a problem so they know what type of evaluations to do. They're not just going to run every possible evaluation. It's a waste of the child's time pulling them out of school. It's a waste of the school district's money and resources, and they're not going to do it. But the real flag is not that they're failing. And a lot of schools will say their grades are fine. They're obviously doing well. They don't need these services. But New York State says that they have to be adversely affected. The way that that can be measured is typically through standardized testing. As an OT, I conduct standardized testing all the time of kids' fine motor skills and their sensory processing. So all standardized tests are graded on a bell curve. And it doesn't go by the middle line as typical, or they use normal in the tests, but there's a range of normal. If your child is in that range of normal, even if it's on the way low end, they're not going to qualify. In fact, if they're outside of that range of normal a little bit, they're still not going to qualify. That's usually not enough to say they're adversely affected. So it goes by standard deviations. And one standard deviation is from that center 50% average out. And that range of normal is your one standard deviation. So if you're one standard deviation from that 50% average, there is no deficit at all that's considered within an acceptable range. They have to be outside of that to at least 1.5 standard deviations. So an additional, like 50% more. And typically for schools, on a standardized test, they have to show a deficit of 1.5 standard deviations in at least 2 different areas to actually be adversely affected. Now, there's some legal cases where that's been challenged, and there might be some exceptions. And there are certain districts that are like, they're, we're worried about them and they're slightly outside normal, we'll give them services, but that's definitely not the norm. Typically 1.5 standard deviations in 2 different areas is the baseline for qualifying and being eligible for services or needing an IEP. However, if a child is a full 2 standard deviations outside of the typical, of course on the low end, then they can qualify based on just that one area. So typically that's when you hear again that a therapist or a psychologist or whoever is doing the testing will say that they qualify for services because they're more than 2 standard deviations below that normal range. For the everyday mom and dad, that's hard to figure out because you're not an evaluating tester. We just have to rely on the reports. There are some things that are difficult to test, like attention to task. That's where we get into the gray muddling area. And do your due diligence, notes home from the teacher about behavioral disruptions, save them, bring them to the meeting, say, listen, this is what's going on. I'm getting 3 notes home per week. This is definitely adversely affecting, and use those words, my child's performance in school. Whether it's anxiety attacks or, inattention, all that stuff that's hard to measure. If you want your kid to get services, find a way to measure it any way you can. Outside notes from psychologists, anything like that. So good luck, parents. If you've got questions that you want answered in my next video, you know where to put them, down in those comments. Thanks all, and happy school year.